Today we're going to take a look at number 106, The Missing Link. Since the time that we did the video 102 and 0103, I got this instrument in, and I've also had a chance to look at pictures of 101. When I was looking at the pictures of 101, it didn't really have any Rudy in it. And as you recall from the last video, Rudy was the guy who did the metal work. And so I was looking through the grills on 101, and it just wasn't him. He does really tiny flanges, and this had huge flanges and stuff like that. And the solder work just didn't look like him. And I came to find out that it was John Dopera who was really responsible for building the first one almost totally. Now, I'm sure the brothers got together and talked about this. Don't get me wrong. Rudy was a very smart guy. But I didn't see him in that guitar, and it was really kind of interesting. Now, the other thing that came to light was that this should have been a totally different guitar. I thought about number 102, and I thought, well, if John did the first one, and I didn't see Rudy in it, and Rudy did Rudy just do the whole second one? I mean, I don't see John in it, really. And I thought, well, that's an interesting trade-off. Somebody comes up with the main idea and then hands it off to his brother. Started to make a little bit more sense. It turns out, the other piece of information that I got, which is really interesting, is that Rudy was known in the family as the mechanic. And basically, John was coming up with the grand ideas with Rudy, I'm sure, and handing it off to the mechanic. Because basically, there's a lot of stuff going on in 1927. They're starting a company, they're doing prototypes, and I was thinking, you know, what's John doing during all this time? And he's actually working on the single cone. It's going to be an 8-inch, and it's going to go in a mandolin. So everybody's busy. They're shoving stuff off. People are working on their strengths. It was really a beautiful thing. And this guitar answers a lot of questions, and it also is really the link between 102 and 103. So let's take a closer look at number 106 and see if we can connect the dots. Now, here's one mystery right here. You've got the T-bridge that's the same as 103, and you've got the modern cones with the crimped edge. So this says that this guitar was sitting around until they had gotten 103 done and figured out cones for it. Because they didn't want to use the smaller cones that they had on 102. They wanted this to be the next generation, again, more problem solving. So this guitar was actually assembled after 103, because that was the first time that these cones were available. And another interesting thing is that we looked at the pock marks on the cone would get progressively worse as these cones were being stamped. So these were definitely stamped after the cones that were in 103, I can tell you that. Here's this lip for the cover plate to sit in. Now that's really a tricky maneuver. Rudy figured out how to solder a piece underneath for the step down, and that had another piece of solder on it so they could solder in this metal piece that holds the wooden pan. It's got your typical wooden pan, but the key here, and this is one of the criteria, is that this is a short pan, just like the one on 102. You can see here silver paint, and what that silver paint over here is covering is some newspaper, because they had a hard time fitting these corners. Over here is another chunk of paper, but he didn't bother to paint that silver because he sort of had a spill of silver paint over here, so I think he gave up on the idea of doing that. The thing for me was that I was so tempted to take this piece of paper out and look for a date or some news, find out what was going on the day that they made this pan. But the pan fits so nicely there was no reason to disturb that piece, so I guess we'll never know. Now if we look at the posts and pads, this one is just like on 102 and 103. It's got the metal plate and with a little cup for the square piece of wood to sit in. But the front post and pad here is made like a modern one. They just had one of the old style and one of the new style. So that really also places it in the timeline of where we need it to be. If this guitar really is the missing link, there's some criteria that has to be met. One is, it's got to have hand-cut cover plate. this is a hand-cut cover plate. And we can tell that by the corners being slightly funky and the lines are just not quite right. But we can also see this lip right here. Now this was not stamped in the modern ones. We only see this lip on 102. And in 102, this lip was to reinforce the cover plate. It had no reinforcement underneath it, so that was a problem. This is also a plated instrument. 102 wasn't plated, and that's interesting too. So they solved the solder seam problem that we saw in 102 by plating the instrument, and it really worked out well. You don't see any seams on this guitar whatsoever. So the other thing you'll notice here is that the screens are going the wrong way. Now 102 didn't have screens, and the modern screens sort of imitate the diamond pattern that goes through. This is actually the correct alignment for this one, but these two, the screens are polar opposite to what they're going to do after this. But the screens are really important because they also stiffen up the top. And that, combined with the extra reinforcement that you'll see here, really made this quite a nice stiff unit, or at least stiffer. They still have a little bit of wag to them. Now, another thing here that's really interesting is you'll see this sort of half smile, or half frown, I guess, of solder. And that tells us that originally they tried a curved brace here for whatever reason and abandoned that and just went to a short straight one, which is what they still do today. You'll see this gasket around here, which is actually a shoelace. This guitar now has a lip for this cover plate to sit in, and they needed a gasket so it wouldn't rattle. On 102, the top of the guitar was flat, there was no lip for this to sit in, they didn't have a gasket. It was a problem. Once again, more problem solving. Another telltale sign of Rudy here is this fretboard. Now it's held on with screws underneath the position markers. And on 102, I noticed that this whole fretboard had sort of shifted over to one side. And this one shifted over too. And I figure while he was putting in the screws, it sort of just tweaked everything over to one side. And it's just identical to the other one. You know, it's this cute little fault in both of them. Now when we look at 106, you'll see that it's got the more modern grills to it. 102 had sort of lumpy grills. 103 had grills that looked surprisingly like this. And as it turns out, this guitar was really built before 103. This, I believe, was built right after 102 because 106 solves all the problems that 102 had as far as design goes. They had sort of a wimpy cover plate that needed reinforcing. They still hadn't decided upon the grills. And in the last video, I gave a lot of credit to Rickenbacker, but I hadn't seen this guitar yet because there's something obviously happened between 102 and 103. I mean, it was a big change. So when you look at this one, keep in mind that Rudy was actually the one who came up with these design refinements and not Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker was probably a very clever guy, and maybe I just didn't give enough credit to the Dos Perras. Well, it's time to talk about the 900-pound elephant in the room. On practically all the diamond cut holes Nationals, they're open. Number 12 has screens underneath it, but generally speaking, you don't see things that are closed up. And this was built right after 102. So what they did, and this is something it was really an afterthought, because the guitar is plated and these insets are not plated. And they're also sweated in from behind because you don't see big solder joints underneath here. So this was something that after the guitar came back from the plater, they put it together, they went, you know, let's hear this without the holes. And it really adds so much to this. So, you know, is it really just enhancing the aesthetics of the instrument, or is it really an experiment in sound?
I guess I just try and envision in my mind what these guys were doing in their shop. And this, of course, is so handmade. You can tell how this was just all bumped out, pieced together, soldered together. You know, the guitar in its infancy, really.
There's been a lot of talk about how many prototypes were actually made. I personally don't think there were a lot, because hand building one of these things is really a nuisance. And they were solving problems quickly. This after number 2 solved all their structural problems. There really wasn't a lot of reason to have a lot of prototypes sitting around. And they put everything that they learned from 102 and 106 here into 103. And that was the real start of modern National production. I'm Mark Schoenberger for National Guitar Repair. We'll see you again with another cool National.